All right, welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the full stack application. So here you can see I have a couple of directories. We're going to go over project breakdown real quick before we even start um, manipulating anything within our backend framework. But here I have a backend and front end directory. Sometimes people name it server and client. You just want to make sure you separate those two from one another. In my backend directory, I have a virtual environment. You don't necessarily have to have your virtual environment in here. You just have to make sure that your virtual environment doesn't get pushed up to GitHub. I have a .env, which is where I will be storing any sort of keys or any secret information that I need to hold from the APIs will be held in there. I have a server project, which if we take a look at our application or our project here, as I scroll down, you can see that it's connecting to the user app, REST framework, and REST framework auth token to be able to generate a token for a user. We also have our database, which is connecting to PostgreSQL. So here in SQL, you can see I have that auth DB. And if I go to show all of the relationships inside of the database, you'll see that it shows me all of the authentication, the user app, and where is my token? Let's see. Okay. Let me try to do that one more time. Here we go. And here's our token permissions and auth token as well, so that we can visualize it within the database. So I have three separate terminals, one which is just running Vite. So there's Vite. I have one which is running my Python server. You can see that it takes me to a 404 page not found because I'm not currently interacting with any of my API endpoints. All right, so let's go into our API endpoints and see what that looks like. For Vite, we don't have anything in Vite just yet. We're going to be building that afterwards. So let's dive into our backend server. Here inside of Django REST frameworks, I know that it gives me some templates that I can utilize. So I can go ahead and go to API/v1/users/signup. And this takes me to my signup page where I can actually sign up a new user. So here inside, I am going to be sending application JSON. It is asking me what is going to be the content of my application JSON. What I am going to send will be an email. This email will be fr@fr.com. And I will be sending a password. And this password will simply just be fr. All right, I'm going to quickly check my view to make sure that that's all my view needs in order to function. So my view is going to grab the username attribute and set it to the email attribute. So I don't have to worry about actually adding username into these keywords. But let's take a look at the model itself. So the model needs email and pretty simple. This is all I really need in order to create a user. So let's go ahead and send that post request. That post request is sent. And I am now given a token that I can use to communicate with my application. So great. I now have a token. I'm going to go ahead and grab these credentials here. I'm just going to paste them here inside of this .env just so that it's there and I don't have to worry about copying and pasting everything over and over again. All right, so now I'm going to go to my info view. I'm going to check my URL patterns and see which one will trigger the info view. Looks like /info instead of sign up will trigger this information. So I'll go to info. There we can see, hey, this is a get. It's asking me for an authentication. There it is for JSON. Accept token detail authentication credentials. So it's giving me a 401 unauthorized. I'm wondering if it will let me send the request. It will not let me send the request. All right, let's see what else we can utilize to be able to send this request here. I believe somebody said that Thunder client isn't kicking the cheese anymore. Let's try out Thunder client real quick. All All right, we go to Thunder client. We want to go to /info, and I'm just going to go to my headers, make sure that in my headers, I am including in authorization. So there you go. There's my authorization key. And I want to make sure that I have my correct key in there. So here is the token that I want to utilize. I'm going to copy it, come back to Thunder client. I'm going to paste it, and I'm going to send said request. So the request was processed, and I was able to get back my email. So that worked great. Now let's go ahead and log out. If I go back to my views, here I have my logout view. I can go to URLs. It looks like the one that I need to utilize is logout. So here I'll go ahead and change this from info to logout. This is going to be a post request. Send it. Okay, I get 204 no content. Interesting. All right, looks like my VS Code decided to close. Let's bring that right back up. All right, I apologize, everyone. I'm gonna go ahead and take a look at a couple of these terminals here. Make sure they're all back up to speed. I'm gonna reactivate that virtual environment. All right, my virtual environment is running. Let's run Python one more time. Let's run our development server for Vite. And let's go back into our database here, utilizing PSQL, Auth DB. All right, perfect. We're all back up to speed now. Let's bring back up Thunder Client, which is likely what caused our issue here. Non-commercial version of Thunder Client for business or professional use. Please consider purchasing a license. All right, so it looks like this is what shut us down, was Thunder Client. It's not playing nice. That's okay. We've done everything that we really needed to do to confirm that our user application is working. Now we can actually go into developing the front end for this application, for being able to interact with it and log in a user, make that full loop, right? Why did we learn React and everything so separately? How do we actually tie the knot together? Well, I'm going to go into my front end directory. I'm going to delete everything that comes in as default from app.jsx. It's not bothering anything else that I'm doing here. I'm going to delete all of that CSS that also comes in as a default. And I'm going to go ahead and take off this React strict mode. All right. So now there's a bit of things that we can do here. One, we need to go back into installing our React router. So we can run npm install React router DOM. All right, so that installs the React router. We can install Axios for dependencies. And we can also install React Bootstrap. All right. Looks like I forgot what that command was. So I'm just going to go ahead and go to the React Bootstrap site. Go to get started. And grab that command. I was close. All right, so that brings in React Bootstrap. I also need to remember to grab that CSS style sheet and place it within main.jsx. All right, awesome. So now let's go into setting up a couple of pages. I'm going to change directory into source. And actually, I've been moving on to quite a bit of steps before I continue moving on. Does anyone have any questions regarding the project layout of the backend, or does anyone need any sort of refreshing when it comes to Django before I do a deep dive into what I'm doing in the front end? All right, so it looks like the Django piece is good. Um, I'm going to slow down for this React portion because I know it's been a while since we seen React. If we recall, all of our information should be within this SRC, which stands for source directory. Inside of this source directory, I'm going to create two separate smaller directories. And I probably only need one for now, which will be pages. And inside of pages, I can go ahead and create an application or two different pages. So in this case, I'm going to have my homepage.jsx, and I will also have my login page. So I'm just going to call it registration page. All right, so there you go. So now I have my homepage and my registration page. If I open up pages, you can see there's homepage JSX and registration page JSX. So here I'm going to go ahead and create the function, which will be returning JSX. And then I'm going to export default, the homepage. I'm going to copy this and paste that for my registration page as well. All right, so there I have my homepage and my registration page. And that is it for pages for now. Now there's got to be a way for me to interact with this information. Does anybody remember what I need to do in order to set up these pages to where I could see them inside of the application?
You need the router.
Perfect. Yeah, I need to finish creating my router. So I'm going to change directory back into the source, and I'm going to create a router.jsx. Inside of router.jsx, I'm going to import, create browser router. This is going to be from React router DOM. Then I'm going to make a router, which will utilize create browser router, which takes in a list of objects where, ooh, let's look this up. Let's make sure we're doing this properly. Not what I want to see. Looks like Google is providing us an example here. So here's our create browser router. We can specify the path and where individual elements will be showing up. So perfect. Here, we're going to have a path. This path will be of slash. I'm going to have the element, in this case, be the application. And it will have a couple of children. These children at index, which is true, will render the element of homepage. And at path register will render the element of registration page.
Should you include a backslash in front of register? Or am I thinking, or is it the other side?
I think both of these, yeah. Good call. All right, so that takes care of our element there for create browser router. And I can finally export default router. Great, so now we have a router that has been created. Everything has been exported. But now I need to connect it to the actual application that shows up on my screen here. Well, how do I do that? Does anyone remember how to connect the router here?
I think you go to the main.jsx and then yeah, you swap out that information for the router. I don't remember the syntax.
Yeah, so it would be the router provider that takes in a router, and we provide the router that we have created. Perfect. All right, and then finally inside of app.jsx, we just need to make sure that we include our outlet. Great, well, let's take a look at our application now. There you go, we have our home page. And if I go over to register, it shows me my registration page. Nice. Well, now I need a way to easily maneuver between these two. I think a nav bar would be nice. So let me go ahead and create a quick nav bar as well. I'm going to make a component. So I have to make a directory for components. Inside this directory, I will then make a file for my nav bar. All right, so here we are within the nav bar. I'm going to make a function for nav bar that is going to return JSX. And in this case, what it's going to return will be a UL, where it's going to have two list items. And in both of these list items, what I will be utilizing is a link. This link will be to, or take in a to attribute. It will close and then say where they are headed. So one of them will be home, while the other one will be registered. So now we could change this to be a slash and this to be a register. All right, so there's my nav bar. All I have to do now is export default my nav bar. Now, remember, you want to utilize this link here and not an anchor tag, because an anchor tag will re-render your entire application while link does not. I am going to add a little bit of style here. I'm going to go ahead and do display flex. And I'm going to add a justify content. Oh, I did that wrong. I need to fix that. All right, justify content. And then let's just do something like space around. That should do the trick. Well, now I can go back to app.jsx and render my nav bar. And there you go. So now I can go back home and I could go back to registration. All right. That's quite a bit of a refresher. Does anyone have any questions over everything that we've done to this point?
The use state for that one right above your app within app.
Sorry, could you say that one more time? I could barely hear.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, what was the use state there for the app again? The set count?
This was something old that came in when we first created it. We haven't utilized this state
Oh,
yet.
okay, gotcha.
Of course, no problem. Any other questions? All right, if no one has any questions, then let's go ahead and get into the connecting of these two separate applications. The first thing I want to do is I want to actually establish some sort of connection between my app, or excuse me, my front end and my backend server. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my project. I'm simply going to go into urls.py. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function that will return a pretty simple, yes, we are connected response. So this function is going to be called test connection. It's going to take in a request. And all this function is going to do is it will return. And let me go ahead and from Django.res. Response or import some. All right, let me figure out where JSON response come from. HTTP. I was close. All right, from Django HTTP, we're going to import JSON response. And all we're going to do is say, hey, we're connected. Or we could just do something like this. Let's do connected. And let's say that it's true. All right, there you go. All right, additionally, I'm going to go ahead and add a path for just index. And what this is going to do is it's going to trigger the test connection function. All right, my server is still running. Gonna go ahead and open that up here. Oh, that makes sense. It doesn't make sense. Let's see, using the URL config define server.project or URLs. Okay. We do have the path there. All right, there you go. So now it's working. It's able to interact with it. We can send our requests and we're getting back that connected is equal to true. So we build a test connection function so that we can actually interact with our server and understand that everything is connected and working appropriately. Well, now let's do that with V. I actually want to connect to my application and be able to talk to it. But the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to build an asynchronous request because I have an API. I created this API with Django. Now I just need to interact with it utilizing React. And interacting with it is not much different than interacting with any other API that I've interacted with before utilizing Axios. So I'm going to make my function here of test connection. This is going to be an asynchronous function. And what this function is going to do is it's going to have a response. And it's going to send a request to Axios, which did not get imported. That's okay. And it's just simply going to go to my URL pattern for my application. So I'm going to copy it and paste it here. All right, and then let's just console.log the response.data. Now I want this to happen every time my application renders. So I'm going to utilize useEffect to call this function. We'll call the test connection function, and it will have an empty dependency array because it is happening only when the project renders. Okay, so we come here, we inspect, and I can see that we're getting a bit of an error. So let's go ahead and check that out. I'm gonna clear it so that we're not getting anything old. I'm gonna refresh it. So we have 3 different errors. So here's the first one. So access to XML HTTP request at 127.800 origin localhost 5173 has been blocked by course. So cross-origin resource sharing has blocked this communication. When we talked about Django, or when we talked about the full stack application before, we also talked about the 3-way handshake. And the 3-way handshake is essentially the front end makes a request, but before it even makes a request, it kind of meets Django for the first time. And it says, hey, this is me. Do you mind if we have a conversation? Well, what happened here is that exact introduction was given. It said, hey, this is me. Do you mind if we have a conversation? And even though we don't see it on our Django request, because it did get processed as a status 200, and we can see that it said, hey, error failed 200 okay. That doesn't make sense. It was okay. Well, when they were establishing their communication or they did their introductions, Django said, you know what? I don't know you. I don't know where you're coming from. And according to what I've been told, you and I have no reason to be communicating to one another. So it's just not having any conversations with it, right? That's pretty much all that's happening here. So we need to tell Django, hey, it's okay. You need to be able to talk to this individual and share this information. Well, how do we do that? In order to do that, we have to install something called Django course headers. And let me actually show us all here what course headers looks like. And I'll share this with everybody here on the chat as well. Right? It's there on Yankee questions. So Django's course headers, it goes into what exactly it does. It's essentially some middleware. We could write this ourselves if we wanted to from scratch, but somebody already went and did all the hard work for us so that we could just simply add this package into our project and utilize it to be able to globally expose our application. And it goes through the process of showing us how to do it. So the first portion is, well, you might want to install this package. All right, so we go into installing it. Pip install Django course headers. Great, it's been successfully installed. Then it tells me you need to add course headers into your app. So now let me close this massive directory of directories. Go over to my project itself. Server project, settings.py. Great. I'm going to come up top to my installed apps. I'm going to add course headers. All right. Then it tells me, hey, right above common middleware, you should have something called course middleware. So now I look, here's common middleware. And right above it, I'll install that course middleware. All right. And that's it. All right. Just that easily, I was able to apply that information. Now it goes into telling me, hey, if you want to specify which origins you want to be able to talk to, you can. You just need to add this into your settings file. I don't necessarily want to break this down into which exact paths it's going to be able to talk to, especially if this is going to be like an open API that everybody can use. Maybe I want developers to be able to interact with their information if they really want to, or other applications to interact with this. So instead of making it a closed or restricted API, which would be most secured, I'm going to make it open, which is a lot less secure. And I'm going to do that utilizing the course, allow all origins, and that's coming from here. You can see that it's telling me, hey, if you want to allow all of them, you can set this in your settings and it only accepts a variable of true or false. So cores allow all origins is going to be true. All right, so quick review of what we just did. We installed course headers utilizing pip install Django course headers. We added course headers into the installed apps. We went into the middleware portion and added course middleware right above common middleware. That's happening here on line 51. And then finally, in order to allow a communication with all attributes, we went over to course allow all origins. And here in cores allow all origins, we set it to true. All right, so now we have a very friendly server. So when people come and introduce themselves, he's going to be a lot more patient and willing to have a conversation with everybody. And I hear a hand pop up. Juan, go ahead.
Sorry, for the cores allow all origins. You said we're going to change this later to be more restrictive, right?
We're not going to change it later. For demonstrational purposes, we're going to keep it as allow all origins. But if you're making a site that you want to be secured and you don't want your backend to necessarily be exposed or to have any other communication with anybody except for your front-end application, then you would specify each individual URL pattern that you actually want to have a conversation with. Does that answer your question? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. Sam?
Could you go back to the test connection in Django? I
Absolutely.
just want to see the code for that. Okay, request JSON. True.
Here, let me share this. Oh, hello. I'll share here. Yankee questions. All right, Gary?
I was just wondering what exactly is cores allow all origins doing?
So remember that conversation that I described between so do you mean what its actual function is, or what is it doing code wise?
Like what is it referring to as an origin? Because you were talking about making it more strict, just so not anybody can just access the backend.
Got it. So when we're talking about origins, we're talking about where is this request coming from? So if we take a look at the error that happened here, this is where we sent our request, right? Localhost at port 8000. But then it says from origin. So the origin that this request was sent from, the person sending this request or the technology that's introducing itself to our backend server was localhost 5173. But because we never told Django, hey, you can communicate with this person, you can allow this origin, it threw a course error. It's saying, hey, cross-origin resource sharing. So I am sharing my resources from origin 127.0.0.1 at port 8000 with localhost 5173. This was never specified to me, so I'm going to block the communication, right? And what we just did is now we just told Django, hey, you don't have to be so picky. It really doesn't matter who comes up to you to introduce themselves. When they introduce themselves, be nice enough to at least respond, right? So now our server is responding to anyone who tries to communicate with it. Does that answer your question, Gary?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Of course. Owen?
You said if we didn't include the cores allow all origins, we'd have to specify which paths we'd include. Would we have to do like a URL patterns block of code with a empty, like with brackets and everything, or how would that look?
Yeah, so you can either utilize a regex if you want to make it a lot more permissive and there's a specific domain system that you want to utilize. Or if you want to really, really have full control of it, you would put it inside of a list like this.
Gotcha. And then I have one more question. What's an example of an endpoint that you wouldn't want, like just any user to access? I know there's like an endpoint for creating a super user for that account. Would you exclude that then, or what? Just give just one example of like an endpoint you would include in there.
Got it. So these aren't necessarily endpoints that you would include to restrict your API. If you want to restrict your API, you would have to do that through the actual URL patterns in Django side and by hiding the URL patterns, right? What this does is it makes sure. So let's say we're running a financial website, right? And this financial website, for example, I know who is it there's a couple of banks that have an open API that you can actually talk to them, right? Well, if I go to their website on this bank is communicating with the API. So here in Course Allowed Origins, they would have like HTTPS, bankofamerica.com, right? And when I go to bankofamerica.com, we know that's just a template getting rendered by React, but it has permissions to talk to that API, right? Well, now if I try to write a script that tries to interact with this API, maybe I go look at their code, I inspect what's going on, and I'm able to figure out what URL pattern it is that I have to ping in order to communicate with the API. I open up Thunder Client on my local machine and I try sending a request. Well, the moment I do that, because my local machine isn't on here, or wouldn't be accessible on here. Hopefully they wouldn't do something like that, right? When I send that request, that server will immediately say, nope, me and you cannot talk. Like you can't communicate with me, right? Now, maybe they have some other API domain, and we can see that that's the second option here, right? Where maybe you can communicate with us, but in order to communicate with us, you have to do it through this site or through this different package that you can install inside of an application that sends its request through this api.domain.com. Does that make sense, Owen?
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Demi, let's hear it.
Can you go back to your app.jsx?
Sir.
Got you. Would you want to put that like that, or would you want to hide that full IP address? Like, would
Uh,
you want to put that somewhat kind of like a token? Would you want to treat that like a token or no?
So you can try to hide it, but in reality, when you're sending requests, anything that gets placed on the front end, it's going to become exposed. So you don't have to. We are going to talk about isolating this code better. This is kind of where the importance comes in. If you don't want anybody being able to ping this information other than your one domain, then your course allowed origins would have specific URL patterns so that other people can communicate with them. But the URL patterns are going to be exposed, whether we like it or not.
Got you. Okay, that makes sense. All right, appreciate it.
Voice. All right. I'm not seeing anything in Yankee questions. So let's go ahead and see what our communication looks like now. Gonna come over to my Vite. I'm going to get rid of all my errors inside of my console. I'm going to send my request one more time. All right. Well, now I didn't get an error. I only have 3 user messages. So I see Vite is connecting, Vite is connected, and I see a request was sent, and I get back connected is true. Right? So that's my inside of URLs. Here's my test connection, which is returning connected is true. Great. So now I can change my little bit of my logic here. I can say, hey, if response.data.connected, I can alert, not communicating with server, else alert communication established. Oh, come on, man. Let me write it out. Established with server. All right. So there we can see, hey, the communication has been established with the server. Fantastic. So now we were able to send our request. We get back of whether it's connected or not, and we have a conditional statement telling us, hey, are we connected or are we not connected? This is likely something that we would only do during development time. We definitely wouldn't push this this little test connection into something like production. This is more for us to be able to see, okay, we're connected. We can actually talk to one another now. All right, I'm going to actually remove these alerts and change them for console.logs because I do not want to deal with alerts over and over again. All right, fantastic. So now we have our communication. We're finally able to talk to our front end and our back end. They were able to introduce themselves to one another, and Django turned around and said, "You know what? I guess we can talk. Let me see what information I can give you, depending on the questions that you have." All right, great. Well, now everything moving forward is going to be pretty simple, right? If we want to send a registration or set up a registration form, all we need to do is we need to capture the email and password of said user. And we need to understand if we're going to be sending a registration or we're going to be sending, excuse me, or we're going to be sending a login. So let's go into some React here and see what we can grab from React. Leave in forms, we may have one. There you go. So forms provide us a pretty good one here. Going to come over to my components. Here you go. And here I'm going to go ahead and make my registration form. All right, so now for this registration form, just going to change the name of it to registration form. All right, we have our email, we have our password. We're not using it yet, but let me go ahead and bring that into our page. So there you go. There's my registration form coming in. And good, we got that straight from React. We were able to communicate. We have our established communication with our server still. And here I'm able to grab an email and a password. Good. Does anyone have any questions over how I did this?
Could you kind of do like a quick overview slash recap?
Absolutely. So we went to React Bootstrap. We found the form that we wanted to utilize, which is just the email address and password. I created a registration form inside of my components directory where I pasted all of the code straight from React Bootstrap. It has our form here that we can utilize to capture our users' information. And then we put it inside of the registration page inside of line 7.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. All right, so now let's get into how do we capture this information, right? We're going to need a couple of use states. So here I'm going to go ahead and grab email and set email. This is going to be equal to use state. I'm going to grab password and set password. I'm going to make that equal to a use state of an empty string. And then finally, I need to do one for, is this a registration? Set registration. And this one's actually going to be a Boolean. So for now, I'm going to default it to true. So unless we change this, it will always be a registration. Or I guess I should do this as false. All right. So now here's my email. Here's my form control. Here's my text. So inside of my form control, I'm going to add an onChange event and say, hey, onChange, I want you to capture the event. And I'm going to set email to event.target.value. And then I'm going to set the value to email. I'm going to do the same thing for password. I'm going to come down to where I am typing in the password here. And here I'm going to set the value to password. And I'm going to add an on-change event where I will be setting the password to event.target.value. All right, so now I'm able to capture both my password, I'm able to capture my email, but I could change something as well here. So here we have a checkbox that I can utilize to change whether this is going to be a registration or not. So I'm going to go ahead and add a value saying registration. And I'm going to add an event saying on change. I want to capture the event and set registration to event.target.checked. And instead of saying check me out, I wanted to say register. All right, awesome. Go ahead, Owen.
Why wouldn't you want to do an on-click event since there's a button there?
Like clicking the button, why would that be a non-click event?
Yeah, like with your form check, wouldn't you not want to register? Because to me, on change, that means I guess the form check is part of the button. I'm trying to wrap my head around it.
Got it. So let's, yeah,
Going back to my first question, why wouldn't you do on click?
got it. So because it's a register button, I want users to be able to go back and forth. You know, if they accidentally click like, oh, I'm going to register, and then they remember, oh, wait, no, I don't need to register. I already have an account. They could just unclick it and then send their request.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, so let's make sure we're capturing all of these values. Let's create a function here that will just console.log all of these. So let's say, hey, no. Let's do a form submit, or let's just call it handle submit. And this function will take in an event. The first thing that it will do is it will prevent the default behavior of the form. And then afterwards, I just want it to console.log the data from the form. All right, let's just say, hey, I want let form data equal to an object where we have email is email. We have password as password. And we have registration. That's registration. And we just simply want to console.log this form data. All right, so that's what the handle submit is doing for now. I'm going to add it as an event handler. So I'm going to say, hey, on submit, I want you to trigger the handle submit function. And we just need to make sure we pass in the event to said function. Let me share this block of code with everybody as well so that everyone has it accessible in case anyone is following along. All right, let's take a look at our registration page now. Can inspect it. Let's go over to console. Let me refresh it. All right, we don't have any issues. We're still able to talk to Django. Great. I'm going to go ahead and do fr@fr.com, add my password, which should be fr. I am not registering. I'm going to click on submit. Great. So I was able to send my request. Well, it's not sending my request. It's able to capture my information. It grabs my email, my password, and it's able to register or tell whether I'm registering or not. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we built out the functionality for this form to be able to capture the user input? Let's hear it, Juan.
I'm pretty sure we're about to go over this, hopefully soon, but the logic for validation, whether it be the actual validators or validating here on the front end, I'm assuming we're going to be utilizing the validators in the back end for the majority of it.
So you should have validators in the backend. You definitely should have validators in the backend because that's what protects your database. I do not recommend to only utilize validators in the backend though. You should have validators in the front end as well being applied. So if you, it turns into a lot of repetitive stuff because you're essentially writing the same validator just in JavaScript instead of Python. But you would want to include it in both ways. Does that answer your question, Juan?
Yeah, I'm assuming it'd also be a little bit more efficient too because you'll get a quicker response from the front end, or is that not true?
I don't think it would speed up the response. I think it's more about you want to secure it as much as possible, not just in the back end, but also from the front end, right? Because if we just don't want to run the risk of people inputting improper data, not only that, but people make mistakes. If we assume that a user will be able to follow directions, they are not going to, and then you're going to run into some issues. Awesome. I see the head nods. Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, the next portion of our lecture is going to be actually isolating this request and creating an Axios function that will send this request. We've been going on for quite a while now, and I don't think I will be able to cover it before we hit our 10-minute break mark. So let's go ahead and take a 10-minute break now, and let's come back at 10:07 to continue on with our lecture. Thanks so much, everyone. All right, welcome back, everyone, or everybody will be coming back soon here shortly. So now, right before we left on break, we were able to capture all of our users' information utilizing this nice little registration form here. But now I want to actually communicate utilizing Axios. Now, instead of having all of my API calls be repetitive and sending all my API calls over and over again, I think what I want to do is I want to create an instance for Axios to be able to send my communication to my API. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and create a new file within my SRC directory called utilities. And what I'm going to do within utilities JSX is I am actually going to create an Axios instance or an instance of Axios. Now, what does that mean? We've heard of instantiating something before. Does anyone remember where that term or that phrase comes from and what that relates to?
Object-oriented programming.
All right, awesome. Yeah, it's more for OOP, and what we're talking about here is creating a version of a class, right? We create a class, which is just a blueprint, and then we give it attributes, and we basically fill in said class by giving it guts and life, and that's what creates an instance, right? So here in this utility JSX, I'm going to grab Axios from Axios. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to export something called API. And what API is going to be is an Axios instance that will have the base URL as follows of HTTP 127.0.0.1 at port 8000 /API /v1. All right, let's go over to our backend server and make sure that matches here. Can open up URLs, API /v1. We could add users in there, but we know that our communication may go to different parts of this project as this project evolves. So I'm just going to stop it there, right? API /v1. And that's going to create my Axios instance. Great. Well, now I can utilize this Axios instance pretty much anywhere. I have my registration form, and my registration form is able to capture the data. But now that it's capturing this data, I also wanted to actually send a request for logging in a user. So let's go into that. I'm going to create a function here. And I'm going to export this function as well. And what this function is going to do is it will user registration. That's all I'm going to call it. This is going to be an asynchronous function that takes in one argument, and that will be form data. All right. Now, inside of this form data, I know that I have three separate attributes. I have email, I have password, and I have registration. Right? So all of these are coming from form data. Great. Declared or same expected. This equals a block. Oh, there you go. All right, so now I have all my email, password, and registration, which we were already capturing here and setting it as form data. Okay, so now I can send my request. I can say, hey, I want to say let response be equal, and we don't even need response. We could just grab data be equal to await. And instead of utilizing Axios, I'll utilize API. And I'll say this is going to send a post request. Now this API already has this base URL, so I don't need to include it again. What I do need to include will be this, excuse me, will be the following endpoints, right? So it's going to go to users slash, let's take a look at our URL patterns one more time. So there's user slash, and that connects me to my user app. And I can go over to my URLs in my user app, and I know that it's either going to go to sign up or log in. Great. So I'm just going to turn this into interpolated string here. Because what I want to do is I want to add a block of code in here that will say, hey, I want you to show register. I believe that's what we called it. Oh, excuse me. It will either be sign up or log in. So I want you to run sign up if registration. Oh, and I did that backwards. So let's do that one more time. So we do registration. So if registration is true, then I want this to go to sign up. If registration is not true, then I want it to go to login. All right, that would be the easiest way to accommodate this information. I am passing in registration, which is a Boolean variable. Said Boolean variable will evaluate to either true or false. If it is true, meaning that this is a registration, it will go to users slash sign up, which is what we want here. If it is not a registration, it will go to users slash login and log in a user. Great. So now let's go ahead and for now, we'll just console.log data. We don't need to worry about anything else right now. Oh, actually, yes, we do. We need to pass in the body. That's important. All right, and then the body of my request, I'm going to have email, which will be equal to email, and I'm going to have password. Oh. All right, so there's the body of my request also being sent, and we're going to see what data comes back when I submit this application. So now I've created this function. How do I utilize this function now? Well, I can call it in here. I can turn my handle submit into an asynchronous event. And instead of doing console.log form data, I can say, hey, we want to await for the return value of registration, user registration. There it is. Nice. With born data. All right. Well, let's take a look at Node. Everything is running. Let's open up our console here. All right. Doesn't seem like we have any errors as of now. Let's refresh our page. Everything is working well. Let's do fr@fr.com. FR. I am not sending in a registration, so I'm going to click submit and see what happens. All right, so I clicked on submit. My form was sent. It was able to capture all of my information. It went to the correct URL endpoint of logging in because I didn't click register. Notice that if I click on register and I then send my request, I get an error because my server is telling me, hey, the key of fr@fr.com already exists. So I take away my registration, I send it, and everything's coming back with my correct user token and my user as well. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we made that connection to be able to actually speak to our backend to grab our token and user? Let's hear it, Juan.
Not so much a question, more of a recap. I had gotten a phone call, so my bad. But the user registration, more or less, we're doing an export because of what? What reason again?
Yeah, so my user registration, the reason why I don't have it inside of this page is I want to isolate my code as much as possible. If I'm going to be doing anything that will be interacting with my API moving forward, I'm probably going to keep it inside of this utilities JSX, just so that if at any point I run into an API issue or API conventions change, maybe my URL patterns get updated, I know exactly where it's located and I'm not leaving a huge trail of dependencies all over my files, right? Because if I'm rewriting functions in different places and I'm utilizing the URL endpoint over and over again, if somebody says, you know what, I don't think we should be on V1 anymore, it's time to move on to V2, well, now I have to go through all of the project, all of the files, find everywhere where we're pinging the version 1 of our API and update it to version 2. Whereas if I have it in the way that I'm making it now, everything is isolated in one spot. Does that answer your question, Juan? Awesome. Ryan?
And then sorry, just to recap as well, is the base URL, is that how it knows to talk to our backend API that we're creating?
Yeah, so by assigning the base URL, what essentially we're doing is every time we send a request, all of this will already be included in the URL pattern. So we just need to include the remaining of the endpoint.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. All right, fantastic. Now, let's move forward. We are going to be running into an issue now. Now, this issue specifically is, well, we get back a response. We have the user and the token inside of said response. But how do we handle this token or this user? Because I don't want to store the token just in my React application, because what happens when somebody refreshes the site, right? Token's gone because all of my state variables are now gone. Well, where else could I be storing permanent information inside of throughout the browser? Well, let's check it out. Let's take a look at GitHub real quick and see what they do. Right? Because this is all just a template, probably not made with React, probably made with some other template. But I wonder where they store my authentication. Well, if I go over here to my application tab and I go to the cookies, I come down and you can see that they have my user session being saved in here. And if I refresh the browser or I leave the site, well, my user session is still in here. So maybe they're onto something. Maybe that's something that I can mimic to be able to save my information. There's also called local storage. And inside of local storage, I have all of these key value pairs for references, for colors, and all the curriculum stuff that I go to. Nice. So that gives me a little bit of a background of what I can utilize. Let me check the chat here and see what we have. Okay, got it. All right, so if I can't store it inside of my code, because every time I refresh it, my code makes it disappear, well, then I need to store it within the browser itself. I need to tell the browser, hey, this is something important that I need you to remember every time the page refreshes or whether the page refreshes or not. And the way we're going to do that is by placing our token and key inside, I'm just going to delete that, inside of local storage. All right, so we'll have a key value pair in local storage for our information. Well, let's go into how to do that. So first, I'm going to backtrack here. I'm going to actually grab our response. And the reason why I'm backtracking to grab our response is because I want to ensure that my response was successful. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the status of said response and ensure that it is equal to a 200 or the response dot status is equal to 201 because it's either going to create or log in, right? So there's our two different types of responses there. Well, now that I have that, I can actually grab things out of data. So I can grab both the token and my user from data, or excuse me, response.data. So now I have token and user coming in from response.data. Great. Well, I'm going to return the user to my application eventually. But what about that token? Well, we just said that we want to store it inside of local storage. And because this is actually very common, JavaScript has a pretty good functionality for setting items inside of local storage. So we just call the local storage. We then use the function of set item. And set item takes in two arguments. One, the key that we want to name it as. In this case, we'll name it as token. And the second argument is the value. So for the second argument, we'll pass the actual token itself. All right. Now, if this doesn't work, I want it to alert me saying, hey, I'm just going to alert me with response.data. And I want to return null. Because if I don't have a user, then I don't really need to see the user, right? All right, so now let's go back over to app.jsx, or excuse me, that's not where it's at. It's in registration form. And what we're going to do is we're going to say const user is equal to, and then I'm going to console.log set user. All right, so now let's go through this entire process again. So I'm going to go ahead and do fr@fr.com. fr, I am not registering. I'm going to click on submit. We can see that I received a post request in my Django server. So Django received the request. It was able to authenticate my credentials and return a token and user. We can see that inside of my utilities, I said local storage. I set an item of token with the correct value. And you can see it inside of my local storage. Now let's take a look at the console. In console, well, my function returns the user component. And if I go to my registration form, I am logging it to the console, which is just my user of fr@fr.com. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we did that portion? Let's hear it.
Yes, what did set item come from? I think that was on your utilities, JSX, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So local storage is basically a class that has methods. The class of local storage has a method called set item. And what set item does is it adds an item to our local storage inside of the application, wherever this is being rendered. Does that answer your question, James?
Yes, thank you.
All right. It doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So I'm going to go ahead and push forward here. Now that we were able to, oh, thank you, Roger, for sharing that link. Now that we were able to save information into our local storage, we need to also handle the user, right? How do I know that the user is actually logged in? Oh, probably shouldn't have done that. Let me run that again. There you go. How do I know that the user is actually logged in? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a user throughout my entire application. So here in app.jsx, I'm going to add a const of user and set user and make that equal to a use state of null. And I'm going to quickly add something here where I'm going to say, hey, my application is going to have an H1 element that will say, welcome. Let's change that up. And then in there, I'll say, hey, if there is a user, then display user. And I could just do this. All right. So as of right now, there isn't a user. I am sending my information. I'm actually going to comment out this block of code here just so that it's not, oh, hello. It's not continuously populating. But now how do I actually set the user when somebody signs up? Well, I need to pass this through the outlet context. So I'm going to add a context here. And this is going to take in the user and set user. All right, that all gets passed down through context. I can now utilize it, utilizing use outlet context. So I can come over to my registration form. And in my registration form, I can say, hey, I want to const grab set user. And I want to grab this from use outlet context. All right. Now, instead of console.logging my user, what I can do is I can set the user. All right. So now let's take a look at what our application looks like. Again, we go into fr@fr.com. We pass in fr. We submit. And now we can see it says, welcome fr@fr.com because I was successful in logging in. Nice. So now I was successful in logging in. I can go back to home. I could go back to register and it'll show me my registration form. I don't really need to re-register, right? Because now I have all of my information that I really need. Great. So now I'm able to display my fr@fr.com. I'm able to register or sign up a user. Actually, we haven't gone into signing up a user, so let's try that. Let's do xa.com, and let's do xa. Say, hey, I want to register this user and submit that. If I come over to the top, we can see that it says xa@xa.com because it was successful. And if I come over to my application, it shows me a different token than the one I had before. So I'm able to register or log in. Fantastic. Does anyone have any questions over how we pass down the set user attribute and how we got it to show up inside of app.jsx? Let's hear it, James.
Yes, can you briefly remind me about line 27, the user and user that you have there? Because I know you was about to do an if statement, then you changed it to the user and user.
Yeah, that's a great question. So if I am in React, you could either do an if statement and check, hey, if there is value inside of this, then render this, else do this, which works just like a conditional. The and operator is more specific to null. So it's saying, hey, if this is null, don't do anything. But if it is not null, then return that element itself, right? It's just saying, is this not null? If it's not null, then return set element. Does that answer your question, James? I see the head nods.
Yes, thank you.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? Go ahead, Owen.
Yeah, can you show where you exported user and set user in the outlet context? I didn't catch that.
Absolutely. So here we made the user itself, and let me bring this down so that it's all consolidated. So here we made the user itself as a use state. We passed it down in the context, which makes it globally available to anything that's inside of the children. And then within the registration form, I grabbed it out of use outlet context, utilizing set user on line 8.
Cool. So you didn't have to manually export that; it just automatically did that since you put it in your outlet.
Right. Because I put it,
Okay.
yeah, because I put it. Awesome.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, so now I have my user. Everything is working pretty well. Let's go ahead and go into being able to log out, right? Where's my navbar? Where did you go, navbar? There you are. All right, so in my navbar, I want to have a button that will log out a user. And I only want this to show up if there is a user. So let's go ahead and do where we pass the user in as a prop. And we can say, actually, as a matter of fact, we don't need this either. We can say, hey, if there is a user, I want you to render the following. Otherwise, I want you to render nothing. And let me add a fragment there because it's freaking out. There you go. All right, so we currently have a user. Oh, did I get those backwards? Oh, no, I didn't get those backwards. Let me fix this real quick. So if there is a user, I want you to show home. Why isn't it showing home then? Oh, it's because I'm not passing it down. I apologize, everyone. Let me go ahead and pass that down here. So let's do user is equal to user. Now let's go to my nav bar. Instead of showing null, I just want you to show the registration. All right, there you go. That makes more sense. And inside of this link here, I'm just going to have a button for sign. And I don't have a button. All right, so we can see there, it's only showing me the register. So let's go ahead and sign someone in. All right, I signed someone in and now it shows me home and sign out. Great. Well, now I need to add a function for sign out to be able to sign somebody out. So let's create said function. So for set function, I'm going to do export const sign out. This will be an asynchronous function that will not take in any arguments. What this function is going to do is it's going to let response be equal to await API.post. Then I could check my URL patterns here. It's only going to users/logout. I can say users/logout. Doesn't carry anything else in it. Oh, I stand corrected. It does carry something else in it. Got it. All right. So let's backtrack a little bit, and I apologize, everyone. When I send this request, it's going to fail. And let me actually show us why it's going to fail. Let's say console.log response. All right, so there's our sign out. It's being exported. Let's go over to the nav bar and do our onClick function here. It's going to trigger sign out. All right, I click on sign out, and you can see here that a post request was sent, but we're getting a 401 unauthorized. Why is that happening? Why am I getting a 401 unauthorized? Can anybody take a guess here?
You didn't store your token in the. No, never mind. I don't
Well,
know.
you're pretty close, right? It does have something to do with the token because that's how Django is authenticating us.
Oh, you have to delete the token, right?
Did you pass the token in the body?
Nice. So we could pass the token in the body. But if we pass the token in the body, we would have to do it every time we send a request, and it would also be exposed. Probably not the best way of doing it, right? So instead, when we sign somebody in, not only do we want to set the token inside of our local storage, we also want to add it to our common headers. And we do that doing this. We want to enter API, which is inside of Axios. Inside of API, there's a dictionary that holds defaults, which also has another object that holds headers, which also has another object named common. And in there, we're going to simply access the authorization key. We're going to give it a value of token with token. All right. There you go. So now we have our function here. Let's go ahead and refresh our site there. We're going to go to the registration. Inside of registration, I'm going to go ahead and do fr@fr.com, pass in fr, we submit, and now it's able to hold our information, all right? It sent it, nothing necessarily changed. I'm not able to see a change here, but if we take a look at Thunder Client, which it's unfortunate that now we have to have a license for.
Postman.
Sorry, can you say
You can
that?
use Postman if you need to, if you have that downloaded.
Oh, use what? I'm sorry.
It's called Postman.
Oh, Postman. Yeah, we could use Postman as well. All right. Well, here we can see that we have our HTTP headers, which has authorization, right? Well, that's what this line of code is essentially mimicking. We are adding an authorization header with the correct value of token space and then our hash token. Well, now when I click sign out, it's actually able to process that request. And if I take a look at the console, I can see a response came back. That was just an object. It has no data. It comes back with status 204. Great. So let's continue moving forward here. We go back to our registration. Well, excuse me, we go back to utilities. In utilities, we can see that this worked. It was able to send our request. And we want to make sure it worked. So I'm going to check if response.status is equal to 204. Then I want to return null. And then otherwise, I want to alert failure to log out. All right. So now we go back to our registration form here. Excuse me, we go back to our nav bar. We are calling sign out. So everything is working great there. But sign out is going to be returning something, right? It's returning null. Now, I'm having it return null because I want to set that to a value of user. So I'm going to grab the set user function as well and ensure that gets passed in. as a prompt. All right, so we're passing user and set user as props to navbar. We're grabbing them inside of navbar. And now, currently, I'm utilizing user to dictate what it is that I'm rendering on the screen. But now I can add a function. So I can say const logout, which is going to be an asynchronous function. We'll set user to the value of await sign out. And now in my onClick function, I could just call logout. All right, so let's refresh our entire application here. We're in the registration form. Let's do fr@fr.com, fr. We go, it's submitted. I have FR now. I go to sign out, and now I'm able to sign out, and everything is working great. I was able to log out a user, log in a user, and register a brand new user. All right. Let me share these lines of code here with everybody. I'm sure someone's following along. And I heard a question. Go ahead and send it.
The API.defaults, the header is common. That's in the login only, or is it in the login and the sign in?
So this is both for login and sign in.
Oh, right.
And we're accounting for the registration. So it's doing it for both of them. It's setting it on the local storage, and it's also setting it into the common authorization header.
Got it. Thank you.
Of course. All right. So now we have all of our information. Everything is working great. You know what? I think instead of just not returning anything, because that would return undefined, and we don't necessarily want that, I'm going to return the value of the user. So I'll just pass the user here, just in case that fails in login in somebody logging out. All right, great. So now everything is working great, or for the majority, it's working pretty well. But notice that every time I refresh my page, my user disappears. I don't want my user to have to log in every single time the page refreshes. So how do I fix that? Well, let me check if my token was able to persist. All right, I go over to my application. My token's still there. So if my token is still there, I don't necessarily have to re-sign in a user every single time. Maybe all I have to do is create a function that checks if the token is there. And if said token is there, it just logs in my user. So let's check that out. I'm going to go to utilities. I'm going to say export const info or get info, which is going to be an asynchronous function. Here, I'm going to go ahead and grab a token. So I'm going to say token is equal to local storage dot get item, and it's going to grab token. All right, so now I have my token available to me. Now, because I did refresh it, I'll have to go ahead and set it into the headers and do all of these common stuff. But before I do that, maybe I could just check if token, right? Because I don't want to do all of this logic if the token doesn't even exist. So else, this is going to return null. But if there is a token, then I want API dot defaults dot headers dot common. Nice. Authorization to be equal to token. All right. And then I also want to send my request after that. I don't need to set it inside the local storage because it's already there. So now I can say API dot or let response be equal to API dot get. And this is going to go to users slash info. And let me make sure that that is correct, as a matter of fact. Let's close that out. Yep, it's going to user/info. And my info view is actually just going to return the email. Great. So now I can go back to my utilities. It's going to send said request to info, and I know that's returning the email. So now I can say if response dot status. Oh, hello. Oh, I forgot to await. Good catch. Response dot status is equal to 200. Then I am going to return response.data.email, because that will be the user. And then otherwise, it will still return null. All right, so there's my get info view. First, it checks, do I have a token inside of local storage? Well, because I do have a token inside of local storage, I'm going to set it as my default header for authorization. I am then going to send a request to grab this user's info. I'm going to make sure that request was processed correctly. And if it was, I'm going to return that email for said user. If that request was not processed correctly, I'm going to return null. And if I don't have a token inside of local storage, I am also going to return null. All right. Now, how do I use this function? Well, it's pretty simple. We have app.jsx here. All I'm going to do is I'm going to create a use effect. This use effect, which we know takes in a function, is just going to set user to await get info. And it's complaining. All right. Const grab user equal to have to create into an async function because React. All right, set user. And then after that, I just call the grab user function. All right. So there you go. I've created it all. We can see that it's working pretty well. If I go to refresh it now, for a split second, it does show up as null. That's okay. It's only a split second. I'm okay with that. But then afterwards, it logs in my user right away. All right, I can go back home. I can go to sign out. Now, I could do it this way, and sure, that works. It's not necessarily ideal. There is something else that I can utilize to make this work a little bit better so that it's not just, giving me that weird glitch that we just saw. What I can use is something called a loader function. So I can come over to my views. Oh, excuse me, my views. I can come over to my router. And inside of my router, I can call something like a loader. And this loader could be the get info function. So there you go. I have a loader function called get info. And this loader function is essentially something that's going to run before the application even renders on my screen. So now instead of doing this every time the function renders, I can just set my use state to use loader data. And there you go. Now I'm not running into any issues. I can refresh it as much as I want. I'm not getting that weird glitch anymore because before my application even renders on the screen, my application waits for this function to be completed. Once this function is completed and I have this value, then my application renders on the screen. Inside of app.jsx, where did you go, app.jsx? There you go. Inside of app.jsx, the initial value of user is to the return of that user loader data, right? So now I'm able to grab my specific information there. Let me make sure that when I log out, I will erase that token. Sign out. Oh, look at that. See, so when I log out, I totally forgot to remove my token. So I need to fix that. So I need to say local storage dot remove item. The item I need to remove is token. And I also need to delete it from my headers. So let me find the correct line of code there. All right, perfect. I need to run delete api.defaults.headers.common authorization. All right, so that will clean everything out. Let's go ahead and log out. I sign out, everything is gone. I go to register, I log in my user. And before I actually log him in, I'm going to refresh the page to make sure that that worked. Okay, great. Now I go to log in my user. It logs me in. I'm able to go back home to the home page. All right. Does anyone have any questions regarding this get info function or how to utilize loaders inside of React Router DOM? All right, it doesn't seem like there are any questions. So let's go ahead and move forward. The last portion that we're going to be covering today is going to be controlling the user navigation, right? Because we do want to have a little bit of control over the navigation of the user. As of now, when somebody visits my site, whether they're logged in or not, they're always going to the homepage. Maybe that's not what I want. Maybe I want my site to immediately direct them to my registration page. And once somebody is logged in, well, why are they staying here? If I have a user that's logged in, why are they still within the registration page, right? It's turning into a problem. So let's fix that. Well, the way we're going to fix that is inside of app.jsx. Inside of app.jsx, we're simply going to create a function or a use effect that will keep track of URL patterns. And we're going to do that with location. So here inside of app.jsx, I'm going to grab two separate hooks. One is going to be navigate, which goes from use navigate. And the other one will be location, which come from use location. These are both from React Router DOM, right? So now I'm able to interact. I'm able to navigate a user, which we see that it's a function. Then I have location, which location is just essentially where in my application I am located at this time. So let's take a look at that. Let's create our use effect. Let's have our use effect just console.log location.pathname. And I want to run this every time location is updated. Okay, so now when I inspect, if I go to the console, I clear it. Let me go ahead and refresh it one more time. 4 user messages. Here we can see that I am inside of register, right? So I'm inside of register. If I click on home, then it shows me that I'm at a slash. So it's able to keep track of the different URL patterns that I am in. Great. Well, now let's actually throw this into effect, right? I'm going to do this all inside of this use effect here. I'm going to say let null user URLs. So no user URL can only be equal to, or maybe I have multiples, but in this case, it should only be able to go to register. That's the only place where they should be allowed to go. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, I want this to check if a user is allowed, which equals no user URL, if it includes, and let me just put the S there to make sure that there's an S. If it includes the current location dot path name. So if the current path name is inside of this null user, then it's allowed, right? The null user can be there. So I could say, hey, if there is a user and is allowed is also being met. So a null user, we're inside of a null user path name right now. That's not good because I now have a user. I want to navigate over to the home page. And then otherwise, if there isn't a user, or we are in a location where we are not allowed to be in, then I want to navigate over to the registration page. All right. And then finally, we'll keep track of location.pathname, and we'll keep track of the user. So you can see this sent me back to the home page, right? I can clear this and refresh it to make sure that I'm not running into any errors. Okay, it's giving me a warning, but I could live with that. If I sign out, it throws me straight into my registration page. And as soon as I log in, it throws me back to my home page. If I refresh the site, everything works because I'm utilizing that loader function. So I'm able to have a user before any of this use effect is even triggered. So I can send me back to my home page. And that is it for the full stack application. We were now able to connect our front end and our back end to be able to communicate with one another. Let's do a quick recap over, actually, before I even knock into the recap, does anyone have any questions over anything that we just covered? All right, I see no questions, so let's go ahead and kick this off. So in summary, what we did today, first, in settings.py, or when we try to actually communicate to our server, we ran into a CORS error when we were trying to test this connection. Well, we knew that that was happening because when our two servers were talking to each other, and let me go to TL draw and draw this out for everyone. No. Server, and let's do client. Right, the client was sending a request saying, hey, do you mind if we talk? And Django was basically saying, nope, we are not going to talk. Sorry, I'm going to block this communication. I don't know you. There's no reason for us to talk. Well, when we added course, allow origins all to be set to true, that changed the way our server was able to communicate to the client. The client would send a request. Django would say, well, I'm supposed to talk to anybody now. So yes, we can talk. We can actually communicate to one another. And then finally, React would send its next request saying, oh, okay, well, now that we can talk, I need to know if we're connected. And then Django processed the connection and sent back a response saying, hey, we are connected. Now remember, our server right now is stateless. The way we built our API is a stateless server. So after this communication is over, basically all that happens is, here's your response. We get back okay, I got the response. And then the server says, all right, I am going to completely forget who you are. We are done speaking. And that is it. And every time a request is sent between our client and our server, this entire communication of going back and forth is happening over and over again. That's the reason why we have to add our authorization header. And that's the reason because everything is happening stateless. They're not fully connected to one another. All right. So how do we do that in code? We went over to settings. Well, first we installed Django course headers. We then added course headers to the installed apps. We added the course allow all origins equals true into our configuration. In line 51, we added the course middleware. And that's it. That's what opened up our course to be able to talk to everything. Great. Other than that, we didn't really change anything on the server side. On the client side, on the other hand, we did quite a bit of changes. First, we created a router that had an application that rendered two different pages. Now, this had a loader function. We'll go into our loader function here shortly. We then created all of our functions inside of a utilities JSX. First, we created an Axios instance so that we didn't have to write this URL pattern over and over again. We then created a function to handle registration and login. We followed to create a function for being able to sign out. And then finally, a function for being able to get the info of a user. Now in the router, we utilize that get info function so that as soon as our application renders, that before the application even starts rendering on the screen, we get that data from said function so that our user already has a value, whether it's null or an actual user that we have located. We then check their location. If we have a user, we want to make sure that they're in the correct URL patterns so that they're not stuck in the registration page. And if we don't have a user, we need to make sure that they are within the registration page. Finally, our screen renders. We have our welcome statement, which shows a user if there is one. A navigation bar that is dynamic depending on whether we have a user or not. And then the home page or the registration page is being rendered on the screen. And we can see that here. Currently, we have a user. If I sign out, sends me straight to the registration page. If I log back in, sends me back to the home page, and it changes my nav bar to where I have home and sign out. Does anyone have any questions regarding all the information that we covered today? All right, doesn't seem like we have any questions. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording then.